All right. Let's actually take a look at what Dr. Richard Wolff thinks
Pass it a second.
socialism is. For people who don't know who this older gentleman is here, he is a professor of economics. He has a long and storied history of talking about what Marxist economics might look like, what Marxist economics could be and could do in the world, and how that could tangibly improve people's lives, and in general has made a career of critiquing capitalism and talking about what it could do better, etc., etc. Um, I hold him in high regard, so let's watch. I haven't watched this prior, by the way. Let's take a watch this Socialism for Dummies video and see what comes out of it. All right.
Okay. Let me turn then to the big topic for tonight. And we may not have enough time for tonight, but heaven knows it's a big enough topic. Um, the title was As Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Thoughts of Socialism Return Again. So let's talk about socialism. In any American audience, to even say what I just said, let's talk about socialism, gets already scary vibrations surging through the room. So I
True.
need to
True. Many of you might be scared by the word socialism. As we saw yesterday, a politician in 2020. Hello, youth. Welcome to the stream. Um, as we saw yesterday in our, or I guess earlier today in our stream where we were doing the interview with the conservative QAnon politician, yeah, turns out a lot of people when they hear socialism just think bad. So let's see what Dr. Richard Wolff has to say about this, okay?
address those first. I don't want to lose you in the next few minutes. We are a strange country in more ways than one, but one of the strangest things about us is the weird taboo we have lived under for the last half century, which, looking at most of you, takes in most, if not all, of your lives. What's that taboo? We can't talk about socialism. We can't talk about socialism and compare it to capitalism. We can't do it. It's too scary. Any halfway reasonable attempt to look at socialism as one thing and capitalism as another, and look at the strengths and weaknesses of the one and compare them to the strengths and weaknesses of the other, no, that's out. We can have a debate about our education system. We can have a debate about our health system. We can have a debate about what marriage is. I think these are pretty heavy topics. But we cannot have a discussion about socialism and capitalism. Instead of a discussion, we have what? A cheerleading afternoon for capitalism and a make pee-pee on socialism. That's what we do. And I chose my words carefully
Those are the technical terms for it, people, okay?
because I want to suggest childishness. We can't. The legacy of the Cold War, even though the Soviet Union isn't there anymore, still with us. You can't do it. It's been a taboo. To be interested in socialism meant, for most of those years, to be suspected of treason, of disloyalty, of evil without a name, of apostasy, of you name it, that's bad, that's what it is. I like to tell the story, I apologize for those of you who've heard it before, that when I first began teaching as a young professor in this country, I was flabbergasted because I quickly understood that my students thought of socialist, communist, Marxist, anarchist, and terrorist as synonyms. And I made a mistake.
Now, like his audience laughs here. Also, hello, Autumn Leaves. His audience laughs here a little bit, but the reality is that he's not joking, and we even see that on the national stage from our politicians. Like, you have like the conflation of riots and violence with Marxism or with communism, and you have national politicians claiming that Black Lives Matter is a Marxist movement. And that doesn't make any sense, right? If you actually know what Marxism means, you know that what Black Lives Matter is protesting about specifically has nothing to do with a Marxist ideology. Um, but what you might be able to triangulate is that the one of the underlying constants to a lot of the protests in America are really protests against systems of capital that have put people under such immense pressure and put people in such environmental circumstances that it leads to protests. And so there is an additional built-in incentive to conflate, you know, oh, well, these people aren't really protesting for against racial injustice in our policing system. They're actually protesting because on some level we recognize that they have been discriminated against by our capitalist system. So obviously they must be Marxists, you know. Also, hello, Jose of Scranton. Welcome back to the chat. Oh, lovely seeing you, my dude. So let's continue on here.
Mistake. I said, Jesus, these are uneducated people. It wasn't that. I mean, I don't want to say they were educated, but it wasn't that. What it was a reflection of American history. Back in the 1930s, which isn't exactly dinosaur era, back in the 1930s, socialists and communists were okay. There were lots of people who were in the Socialist Party and the Communist Party and who told their friends and neighbors that they were socialists and communists because it was all right. You know, like it is in most European countries. In fact, in part of my family's French, in my French family, there's communists and socialists and middle-of-the-roaders and even people who read Le Figaro, which, if you know European newspapers, is a pretty right-wing paper. But you know, when the family picnic gets together, the communist and the right-winger are eating the same foie gras sandwich. That's a joke, okay? It's very hard to demonize socialists and communists if your Aunt Mary is one. This is hard. And for Europeans, they therefore don't have this problem. But we managed to demonize them, to root them out in the 1940s after the war. And the government and the big business community was very clear that they had really taken it on the chin in the 1930s in the Great Depression with the New Deal, which taxed corporations and the rich to provide Social Security and unemployment benefit and minimum wages and government jobs and all of that. They didn't want that anymore. And they knew they had to get rid of the coalition that made that possible. The coalition of the Communist Party, two socialist parties, and the AFL-CIO, or actually the CIO, not so much the AFL. They weren't together then. So they went after that coalition, and they picked on the weakest link first.
Oh, Archangel DeKalb, this was prior to the years of Reagan. Reagan's like 1970s. They're talking, like, he's talking about 1940s, 1950s. Basically, I know you're Australian, so I'll kind of lay it out a little bit more. In the 1930s, you know, we had the economic crash, the Great Depression, and basically that left a ton of people without work, a ton of people homeless, and it put the our political mechanisms under a great deal of pressure. Specifically because prior to that point, like he was saying, you know, you had people who were openly socialist or communist, or anarchist, what have you. And those political coalitions were able to exert enough pressure on the prevailing parties of the day to essentially get through a compromise. It wasn't explicitly a shift to socialism. It wasn't a shift to communism, but it was the adoption of many socialist policies that we take for granted today. or socialist light policies we take for granted today, like Social Security, Medicare, stuff like that that are kind of staples of our American culture today, or American economy, American political system, what have you. And so a lot of those changes also created tons and tons of government jobs, tons and tons of productivity. But that meant that there were less people in the job market for private companies, and private companies got taxed more to subsidize these public programs. And even though it was a net benefit to everyone overall, the private lobbies that advocated for their respective industries slowly over time began eroding and demonizing these groups that had managed to get enough power to extract these concessions that essentially saved our country. Um, so yeah, that's the case. And you might know a lot of that, but I think that there are a lot of people out there who just think that, like, in America, for example, our education system on our own history is pretty shoddy at best. I think a lot of people grew up learning about the New Deal under FDR. I think a lot of people grew up thinking that that was done out of, like, the goodness of his heart, or because he was a savvy politician. And maybe part of it is that he was a savvy politician, but the greater part is he had to do it as a savvy politician in order to appease these left-wing groups. And it led to some of the greatest, like, prosperity in American history.
The Communist Party, and they destroyed them. They converted them from militant leftists into agents of a foreign power. And as soon as they got rid of the communists, they turned to the socialists. And they went to the American people and they said, socialists, you see, are just like the communists. They just spell it differently. Which is why Americans think communists and socialists, it's all the same. And they all carry bombs in their left rear pockets.
That's why we're called leftists,
under your
by the way.
bed. And they mean you and your puppy lots of harm. So you really should watch out for them. And you really should, and keep away. And so Americans have been good and docile, cut off any that's all badness. So it's very hard to talk about socialism.
It's true. Your puppy is actually a conservative. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to break the news to you, but it's true. I'm sorry. It's got to go. It's got to go.
And it has been for a long time. On the other hand, capitalism, how do I say this politely, hasn't been doing too well for the last 6-7 years. And it has no prospect of getting much better. I don't know if you saw the latest numbers of the economic growth of the United States in the last quarter. Well, I shouldn't call it growth because there wasn't any. And the numbers that came out today about Great Britain and Germany indicate they're not going anywhere either. So there's who's recovering? Nobody. Capitalism isn't doing so well, and then what happens? People begin to say to themselves, even Americans, what else is there? Is there anything else? What could it be? And then dimly, there's a remembrance, oh yeah, there's this other thing, socialism. Scary, but there it is. But Americans are opening up, and they have been for 5 years. Otherwise, there's no way on earth that a man who has withheld nothing about his own self-definition as a socialist, Bernie Sanders, could run for president. That's an amazing thing. In its peculiar way, that's a little bit like, I mean, I know there's many differences, having a black, an African-American, run for president. We were blown away 8 years when that amazing thing happened. And to have a man who doesn't deny that socialist pretty much covers his own sense of who he is is now running for office. I should say not everyone agrees that he's a socialist, and not everyone even agrees that he's Bernie Sanders. I assume you all heard the story. I can't resist. That Sarah Palin was corrected between our last meeting and this one for making a speech that indicated that her handlers, the people who advise her, I guess we shouldn't refer to them as handlers. Anyway, the people who advise her hadn't been careful. So she referred to the new entrant into the Democratic Party as Bernice Anders. So I want you to understand, it's not Bernice Anders, it's Bernie Sanders. That may make a difference to some, but who knows. Okay.
Man, remember this? By the way, this video is from 2015. Yeah, everything seems like it's from incredibly long ago. But yeah, you know what? I support her, okay? You know what? If Bernie Sanders runs again as Bernice Sanders, I support her, okay?
The word socialism, first off, the word socialism has meant many, many different things. And that has been true for hundreds of years. But let's deal with it today. Bernie Sanders calls himself, and is called by many others, a socialist. Barack Obama is called by many people a socialist. No, I mean that. He's called a socialist. You all know that. It happens now. And it's been happening ever since he became an important figure in American politics. Hugo Chavez, the former head of Venezuela, referred to himself as a socialist. The current French government, the president, François Hollande, the majority in the Senate, and the majority in the National Assembly, all three branches of government are controlled by a majority of Socialist Party members who refer to themselves as socialists. So Mr. Hollande, the socialist, works out with Mrs. Merkel, the German conservative, what the policy will be towards Greece. Speaking of which, the government that imposed austerity and was thrown out by the Greek people was the Greek Socialist Party, which was replaced by Syriza, which defeated the socialists and is called by the New York Times a leftist party. Well, what was the Socialist Party? Right? Well, socialists are very important in many European governments. Socialist parties exist in every European country, and in many cases are the second party or even the first party. The Soviet Union is the union of Soviet socialist republics. Hint! The People's Republic of China refers to itself as a socialist. Whoa! Castro's a socialist? This is confusing, isn't it? So what is socialism? There is no answer to that. People who speak about socialism in the singular haven't been paying attention. Socialisms there are, and they have been for a long time. So let's try to unpack where they come from and what the story was.
Yeah, so I think this is what he brings up here is a really interesting point. Like, there are so many different definitions, even on the left, over what socialism means. Now, I keep mine very, very simple. I keep it relatively digestible, and I do that on purpose because I think that it's really easy to get lost in the weeds of people pointing to, like, well, the USSR was socialist, so clearly that's socialism. Like, they called themselves the socialist republics. What about China calls themselves socialist, don't they? Or, like, isn't Cuba socialist? Or people will bring up Venezuela. Like, all of these different things. He's 100% right. All of that confuses the heck out of people, even on the left, So is it any wonder that people on the right like consistently misuse the term and are basically like, well, anyone who's not, in favor of a conservative is a socialist, obviously. Like I don't know. Well, I can't remember 2016 very well because it's been so long. Um, but I can't remember if the right wing was calling Hillary Clinton a socialist. I imagine they were, but I can't like remember that in my head. Maybe one of you out there can back me up on that. Um, oh yeah, and people will say like the Nazis were socialist because they're the National Socialist Party, which is patently ridiculous because even in their own time they literally like shipped off socialists and communists on the left to concentration camps and ghettos and such. So like Nazis like deliberately killed people on the left. It's not they're not a leftist party. That's why they're fascists. They are right wing conservative fascists. What do you think of having guests on sometime? You should get Tay Zonde on the show. I would love to have Tay Zonde on this show. And I would love to have guests as well. It's mostly just a thing of like I'm really bad at planning things, and also like I'm just starting out, so I don't think Tay Zonde would be interested in coming on my show when I only have 200 followers. Hey, maybe when I get up to a couple thousand, okay? Maybe when we make it that far. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it, but let it be known, I would love to have guests on the show. I'm just looking for like prominent guests who can speak with some authority on subjects and might get more viewers onto this channel. Oh yeah, Celador for the Nazis, it was 100% like a branding trick. Kind of like how like there are some brands of food that will brand themselves as like the healthy choice, even though they have like more calories than other things on the market. Or I also just encourage people, if especially if you're on the right and you're watching this somehow. I would encourage you to use your brain for like 10 seconds and just consider the question, should you believe what Nazis say about themselves? Should you take a Nazi at their word? I feel like the answer to that is pretty self-evident. But you come to your own conclusions, okay?
Where even the names come from. And bear with me, it's a little bit of history, but there's no other way that I can think of to do this in a sensible manner. The system before capitalism in Europe was called feudalism. Lords and serfs and feudal manners and all of that. But it was a very organic society. Everybody knew their place. You were a serf, that meant your child was a serf. Everybody was born into a fixed place in a very well-ordered society. The people on top were the lords, and the folks who kept the peace between the lords and the serfs were known as the church. And there was a church, and there was the lords, and it was all, everybody knew where he, she fit. It was a gendered organization, it was a class organization, it was a religious, and everybody had a place. And when that system broke down, we don't have the time right now to deal with it, and an alternative system began to develop and eventually made a violent revolution to destroy feudalism and open the space for itself, that new system, which we now call capitalism, revolted against the old feudalism in two important ways. One, we don't want lords and serfs, none of that. None of those old rules. They trapped people in fixed identities. You couldn't break out. It was very unfair, etc., etc., etc. We are going to break, and we're going to break in the following way. Everybody isn't going to have a place in society. Everybody's going to start at the same point. Everybody's going to be free. Everybody's going to have liberty to develop himself, herself, in whatever. We're going to focus not on the whole, but on the individual. It's the celebration of individualism as the breakout of capitalism. the end of feudalism, the freedom of the individual to do whatever he or she wanted as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else. Remember? You learned that when you were 7. You should have outgrown it when you were 8, but in any case, you learned it when you were 7, and I don't want to upset you about it. And the revolutions made promises. All revolutions do that. And the capitalist revolutions made the promise, well, let's pick the best of them, the French Revolution, 1789. Liberty, equality, fraternity. That you get rid of feudalism, that's what the revolution was about. Remember, they cut off the heads of the queens and kings, which is a symbolic way of saying enough of that. Okay, we have a new system. We're separating people from their heads. And that's a sign we don't like what they represent. So we're going to overthrow feudalism, bloody overthrow, and we're going to establish capitalism, the system where any individual can do whatever he wants. Isn't a serf. Doesn't matter who you were born to. You're free. You're free of feudal obligations. You're free of that old, rigid, structured society. It's an individualist free-for-all. And if we have capitalism, we bring it in, it is the embodiment of freedom in economics, and it will usher in liberty, equality, and brotherhood, fraternity.
Damn, this capitalism sounds pretty based. Pretty based. What's the catch?
1789. By 1850, half a century later, not very long, capitalism is really settling in Europe. Feudalism is dying, what's left of it. But the people in Europe are discovering something. They're discovering that capitalism has indeed replaced feudalism. But liberty, equality, and fraternity is nowhere in sight. Instead of the lord and the serf, we have the capitalist and the proletarian. And they're not getting more and more equal. They're getting, well, you know, like now, further and further apart. And so there begins to be a criticism of capitalism. What happens to all economic systems? It develops critics. Slavery had critics, feudalism had critics, any system, every system we know of, eventually, and it didn't usually take very long, had its critics. Capitalism, having promised so much and having delivered much less, literally developed its own criticism. How could it not? So people began to turn against this capitalism, saying it didn't bring liberty, equality, and fraternity. Didn't bring it, didn't look like it was going to bring it. Was creating a whole new set of contradictions, conflicts, tensions, the things we thought we would overcome and get beyond when we made the revolutions against feudalism. It didn't work out. And what name did the critics come up with? Interesting. They went after capitalism on the very point that capitalism was so proud about, the individualism. This new system had everybody doing whatever they could get away with. It was celebrating that. Its leading economist, a Scottish gentleman who studied divinity. So he was a ennobled Scottish gentleman. Adam Smith, a professor of religion, came up with the following stunning idea. You can see how useful it was. If every person seeks to pursue their own self-interest, it'll all work out for the best for everybody. Jesus, that's nice. Doesn't that make you feel better? I just have to take care of number one, and it'll be the best for everybody. This is very comforting. But as a principle to organize society, oh my God, are you in danger? Because it might turn out that if people go after what's good for them and don't care about the larger implications and the social consequences, you could have a society that tears itself apart. And there were philosophers way back then who warned about it. Thomas Hobbes writes a book, says, you know, this business with everybody pursuing their own self-interest, that's going to make a society in which life is nasty, brutish, and short. That's what he wrote. He wasn't so pleased. He didn't think Adam Smith had this right. Not at all. So what did the critics of capitalism come up with? We're not for the individual first and foremost. We're for the community first and foremost. Not the old kind of society, the feudal. We're not for that. But a new one. A society based on liberty, equality, and brotherhood first, and the individual second. And to call it something, they came up with the name, not individual, but social. Not individualist, socialist. You ever wonder why anti-capitalism isn't another ism that has to do with economics, like capital? Because it's not about the narrow economics. It's about a different vision of how you organize and understand what society is. Socialists were anti-capitalists because they wanted the society as a whole, its well-being, its survival, its growth, its interrelationships among people to be the determinant, the goal, the standard of what's successful as a society and what isn't.
Dang. Sounds like this socialism thing is pretty cool, actually. Like, I don't like the idea necessarily of, like, one guy being able to literally buy out an entire community and, like, dump sewage there because he owns it. I don't like that idea. But I like the idea of having a community that is able to tell, a relatively wealthy person from another community, hey, no, actually, you can't dump sewage in our community, okay? We don't like that. I like the idea of an empowered community. That sounds actually really good and something we should strive for. I hope we learn more about this socialism thing. It sounds pretty cool.
Okay? And that kind of thinking starts at the end of the 18th century. I mean, it has precursors, but at the end of the 18th century, and gets really going in the 19th century as capitalism settles in. It predates Marx. For those of you that are interested in the Marxism part, which is coming in a few minutes, it predates Marx. Marx didn't start socialism or anything like that. Socialists and communists, calling themselves that, existed before Marx was born. He learned about them as he grew up as a young student, but these are not movements or ideas he invented. Absolutely not. But he becomes very important. He gets excited. He feels betrayed. Marx now. And by the way, I concentrate on Marx not for any other reason than simply that has become the most important tradition of anti-capitalist thought and action ever since. Marx from 1818 to 1883. He dies in 1883. That means it's only about 130 years, roughly, since Marx's death. And in that 130 years, Marxism has spread to every country on this planet. There are Marxist journals and Marxist organizations and Marxist unions and Marxist political parties and Marxist professors and Marxist, you name it. Nothing else functions quite like that. Marxism has answered some extraordinarily wide interest in the world to have spread like that. Few movements in the history of the human race have a history of that kind of spread that fast. But by the way, if you spread that to that many different cultures, at that many different levels of cultural and historical and economic development in a short amount of time, of course you're going to have different concepts of socialism and capitalism and communism, because all these different people are trying to get their heads around what that all means. And they're going to come up with different interpretations of Mr. Marx's writings. Therefore, of course, there are multiple socialisms and communisms. The idea that all of that would have come up with one basic idea that everybody agrees to, that's too silly for words.
Yeah, I think that this is something that I should resonate with a lot of conservatives, right? Like when we think about conservatives in the United States, what do we typically think about? We think about, they're white. We think about, you know, most of them tend to be male, and we think about Christianity. And so I think maybe one of the closest analogies that we can come up with for socialism or communism, and to explain to conservatives exactly why, like for example, Venezuela, which is very different from the USSR, and the USSR is very different from China, and all of those are different from Cuba, and how all of these things can be considered socialist to some extent, while not sharing really anything in common when you dig down to like their actual methods of governance, their actual political or economic systems. They're all very vastly different. And I think one of the correlations that we can use to kind of make it make more sense is by tying it to a comparison with Christianity, for example. Like in Christianity, supposedly you have the immutable truth of Christ. You have you have your holy books, you have your original scriptures. I mean, like you can go back to like the Council of Nicaea, or wherever you want to go back to find like this is where like the original documents were. Wherever you want to go back to like establish that. Um, but from that origin point, even if you are a member of what you consider to be the true like teachings of Christ, whether that's like you're an evangelical Protestant, or you're a practicing Catholic, or you're Anglican, or etc. Like any of these different groups, no matter what group you are, you can't deny that there are many, many, many other people on this planet who interpret Christianity, at least to some extent, differently than you do. And, for some people, like the differences between two Protestant churches might be very small. But to other people, like the difference between, like, they're in the United States for a very long time, the difference between Protestants and Catholics dominated our social landscape. And you can probably still find places in America where that's still the case. But even if you think you are practicing like the one true religion of Christianity, you can't deny that there are like millions of other people who interpret it differently than you. And that is just as true of Marxism and socialism as it is of Christianity. I'm not saying that Marxism is a religion. I'm just saying that the act of taking one central work and then interpreting it leads to a lot of different interpretations that gain varying degrees of traction in the wider like community, the wider political discourse sphere, I guess. Like the socialism of Che Guevara, different than the socialism of the USSR, different from the concept of it in Mao, different from how Lenin thought of it, different how Stalin thought about it. There are all of these different ways. That's why there are different names for a lot of these different things. That's why like tankies will go to bat for Mao and Stalin, and there's like, you can be a Stalinist, you can be a Leninist, you can be a Marxist-Leninist, you can be just a Marxist. Like, it gets really confusing very quickly, but I guess in this talk, we're trying to cut through all of that to find a functional definition of socialism that can actually, maybe help us figure it out here in America.
That couldn't happen. It never did happen. The idea that there's a single thing called Marxism or socialism or communism is a fantasy in the eyes of people who don't know very much about this. Okay. Then Marx does come along. And Marx is furious. He says, as a young man, he says this, by the way, as a young man, I thought the French Revolution was the greatest thing there ever was. Liberty, equality, fraternity, that's it. That's what I want. And I was okay with the capitalism because capitalism was going to bring us that. But it didn't, he says. Not only that, he said, when I look at it, you know something? Capitalism isn't the vehicle to do it. Because capitalism replaces the serf and the lord with the proletarian and the capitalist. And that's the same impossible, hostile, contradictory arrangement. So I still love liberty, equality, fraternity. I still love the French Revolution. Marx is very clear about that. But I got to tell you, capitalism isn't the way to get it. Capitalism is the obstacle preventing it. And therefore, we've got to get beyond capitalism if we're going to get liberty, equality, and fraternity. Isn't that a complex argument? And how are we going to do that? Marx writes and thinks with his friend, Freddie Engels. And they come up with an idea. Again, they were not the only ones, but they become so famous that we refer to them a lot. A little bit later, I'll tell you about the difference between the Marxism and the other kinds. But for the moment, Marx and Engels come up with an idea, others do too. How are we going to change capitalism? Go beyond it. What is that going to mean? And they don't do very much with it because they don't know how to guess about the future, and they don't believe in it. We're not prognosticators. We don't know what the future is going to bring. Don't ask us. Nobody does. That's what the word future means. We don't know. But here's what we have. We think that you'd be closer to liberty, equality, and fraternity if the people who made the decisions in every workplace were all the workers who work there. Is it a guarantee that everything will go well then? No. But if you want liberty, equality, and fraternity, then stop having business organized so that a tiny group of people at the top, the owners and the top managers, have all the power and use their power to pick up most of the rewards of the business. That isn't all that surprising, is it? So if you want to go in the direction of more equitable distribution of the fruits of our labor, if you want people to have the time, the leisure, the interest, the knowledge to be in a society of liberty, equality, and brotherhood, then we kind of got to be all pretty much on a par. That's about as far as they went. And that means we can't leave the industry in the hands of the few who have it, who own it.
Guys, I just have to point out, what a simple idea that has been vilified for 130 years. What a simple idea. What if workers had control over their own workplace? How would that affect things? I know that if I had control over my workplace, if I was, working at McDonald's or something, and I had an actual stake in the success of my, you can call it a franchise or store, I would work harder. I would, have more investment rather than flipping burgers for $7.25 an hour. I think most people would, right? Like if you have like a vote in how you're treated in your workplace, if you have the option to be able to work a dignified job with others around you who have similar stake in your business, is it really that surprising that that would be a huge incentive for you to work harder, to be happier at your work, to have more leisure time, to have more profits for your store? Wouldn't those be huge incentives for you as a worker? It seems like a pretty straightforward concept to me, but for a lot of people, that one simple concept is far too alien for them to accept. The idea that the poor, the working class of this country, should have a right to be as free as the people in this country who are wealthy, that is something that for a lot of people they can't accept. They don't want to accept it. And I find that to be one of the greatest barriers here for us to overcome, at least in America. Like there are a lot of people who think, no, if you're flipping burgers, why should you be able to live a decent life? You know, you're clearly you're working that shitty job because you're just some dumb kid and you don't know better, or you're a single mom and you've made poor decisions in your life, so you should suffer as a burger flipper. But that doesn't make any sense to me. Why should a bunch of people suffer working for McDonald's while the people at the top of McDonald's make billions of dollars? Why should that be? Why not have a workplace where people at McDonald's can live dignified lives, even like if they're working 40 hours a week at McDonald's, why shouldn't they be able to live dignified lives? Why shouldn't they have a share in the profits of their business? And I think that it's at the end of the day, socialism is a very reasonable ask, and it's an ask that increases the freedom that people in this country would experience. And I think that there is something deeply wrong in America when we are willing to say, yes, this is a country, this is the land of the free, but people who don't make as much money as me don't deserve to be as free as me. I think that that is something that is deeply wrong in our country and that we need to fix. Um, Corbyn in the UK was talking about a concept Plato talked about, which was there should be a ratio between the top earner in a company and the lowest earner. Celador, I agree with you, but I don't necessarily think that we would actually in a system, a socialist system. I don't think we would actually need to have a policy like that. Mostly because people at the bottom would have as much of a say in the company as the people at the top. So I think that in such a company, for example, it would be reasonable to assume that someone at the top of the company might make more money than someone at the bottom, but it wouldn't it because it is based on votes, everyone would have a say in these policy decisions. I think that that would keep people from making exorbitant amounts of money while contributing relatively little to the company. Um, I think that system has a built-in way of preventing that sort of exploitation. Um, and COVID just proved that too much freedom have bad consequences. Zoos, I don't know that COVID proved that at all, actually. Um, but the issue here is that I think that if you had a worker co-op model, there are ways that you could incentivize people staying at the worker co-op longer, like more shares in the profits of the business the longer you work there. For example, like I think that if you work at a company for 30 years, maybe there's a good argument to be made that your compensation should be greater than someone who just started, a year ago. Like, but these are all small questions that we could have a lot of nuanced conversations about. But the issue, the like fundamental issue here is that I think that uh, maybe there's an argument to be made that someone who worked there for 30 years should make more money than even someone who works at the very top of the company in a worker co-op model. So I think that there are definitely a lot of different ways you could do it. In a way that doesn't necessitate the government stepping in to say, you need to have a certain like a ratio between different people working there, largely because I think communities would self-police themselves in that way. And I might be wrong about that. I'm open to the fact that I could be wrong about that, but um, so far I think that it would be a system that could check itself in that way. If you can't make millions, there's no reason to found a company. Exactly, Zeus. That's one of the main problems behind worker co-ops, actually. However, all of the data we have on worker co-ops indicates that they are more productive, they're more beneficial for society, they are more resilient to bad market forces. So I would argue that the government actually has a lot of incentive in investing in worker co-ops over investing in private businesses. So I would to counter that. Yeah, there might not be a private incentive to found a worker co-op, but there is a social incentive. There is that like the an incentive when it comes to like a societal level. So maybe the government should step in to provide like more attractive loans for worker co-ops, for example. I would be very much in favor of that. Or I'm also very much in favor of in the slow transition to a worker co-op model, having private companies that want to sell. If the owners, founded a company, grew it, and now want to sell it and get out of the business, have them be able to have them first be required to offer the company to the workers that work there. I think that that would be a great way to both incentivize private industry while also slowly transitioning over to a worker co-op model. There are ways around this, and there are people smarter than me have come up with these kinds of solutions. So it's not outside the realm of possibility. It does bring up a barrier to labor movement, though. If you worked somewhere for a long time, you wouldn't want to move, even if you hated your job. Well, I mean, the issue is, Celador, I think that there would be, in a socialist society, there would be less risk of, like, for quitting your job. Like, there would be incentive for you to stay at that company, I think. Like, I think that's, like, a reasonable thing for a worker co-op to do, for example. But I also think that if you really hate your job and you want to change to something else, in a socialist society, yeah, you might make less money, but you're not going to be going homeless or without electricity or without food if like things don't work out during your job change, you know? You would still be relatively well off. You would still have that money saved up from when you were working at the worker co-op. And because there was this decommodification of a lot of things, it would come with a lot less risk to change over to a different kind of job or, starting your own worker co-op or what have you, you know? I think the benefits of worker co-ops outweigh the risks, but I was thinking of negative aspects. Yeah, I mean, and again, I'm open to the idea that maybe I'm wrong about having an incentive for people who are working there for a long time. I also don't think that necessarily, like, someone who's worked there 30 years is going to be making 30 times someone who's only worked there a year. But, like, like reasonably small increases in pay or their investment in the company, I think is very doable. It's just something, I think it's a way it could work. And I'm open to being wrong about that. Um, People don't just stay at home because the right of, the right to freedom. Oh gosh, hiccups. People don't want to use masks all in the name of freedom. Well, yeah, but I would argue that the limits of your personal freedom end when your freedom infringes on other people's rights to freedom, and you getting other people sick in a pandemic isn't. I would argue that that's not a freedom that people should have. Um, in an like a fair and equitable society. You shouldn't have the right to infect other people with a disease that has a 2% chance of killing them, you know? Anyway, continuing on.
And we can't leave it in the hands of the few who manage it. We can't. But they're not going to go quietly. They like being on top. They like being rich. They like making the decisions, and they don't like us, not one bit.
True.
So this is going to be messy. And so most of the 19th century, these people split on the following question. How are we going to make the transition from capitalism to a egalitarian, libertarian, brotherhood-based system in which everybody is roughly equal? One side said, we're going to do that the same way capitalism came in the world. Capitalism came in, Marx's quote, dripping blood from every pore. Whether it's the civil wars in England in the 17th century, or the French Revolution in the 18th, or the American blood, violent revolution was how capitalism was brought into this world. So socialism was going to have to do that too, the revolutionary transformation. The other group said, ooh, take it easy. The people in charge are not going to like to hear any of this. And they're strong, and we're not. And they have the army, and we don't. And they'll use it. We know that. So here's a better plan. We're going to form political parties and campaign for votes. We're going to what? We're going to become parliamentarians. We're going to run for office. But whether you're a revolutionary or, by the way, what they would call the other ones, the evolutionary socialists. Very important. Biggest debate was in Germany, where these positions were worked out by the great thinkers of that time. Evolutionary Socialism, the title of a book by a man named Edward Bernstein, who was the great theorist of this way of going. And he incurred the enormous hostility of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Kautsky and others, the great thinkers of that time, who were in favor of the revolutionary path. But whether you were evolutionary or revolutionary, and here comes an important thing, both of them thought that the way you make the transition is you capture the state. Either by revolution, you overwhelm, you take over the palace, you take over the presidential building, you seize the White House. Or the evolutionary one, you win the election and you become the government. But the idea was you seize the state, and here we go now, and then you use the power of the state that you've captured, either by revolution or evolution, to make the transition. Please be aware, in that way of thinking, the state is the means to get to socialism. Capturing the state is not socialism itself. That would be a grotesque misunderstanding. You capture the state in order to then rearrange the society. Okay, so what happens? Towards the end of the 19th century, into the 20th century, that's what Marxists do. Country after country, they become more and more powerful, and they try to seize the state. The most powerful in Germany, where Edward Bernstein's evolutionary strategy wins, in a sense. The German Socialist Party, Sozialistische Partei Deutschland, SPD, says we are going to become the majority party, take the state and make the revolution then. And they become very, very powerful in the last years of the 19th century and the years before World War I. In Russia, a different party has a different method. They do electoral stuff, but then in the chaos of World War I, when capitalism in Russia is destroyed because it loses World War I, Lenin, an exile in Switzerland at the time, looks at the situation in Russia and says, this is a paraphrase, says, we don't have to wait. We don't have to do this electoral stuff. They are so weak right now, we can take it. A tiny political party, the Bolsheviks, tiny. A huge country, overwhelmingly agrarian. Bolsheviks had 6 peasants in the entire party. They were intellectuals, they were urban people, and so forth, by and large, industrial workers, not peasants, and Russia was a peasant country. But we can do it. We can actually do it. Most other socialists of the time thought Lenin was nuts and told him so. But they already thought Lenin was weird because Lenin, in the face of World War I, had said to the Russian working class, this is a war between imperialists. Workers have no business being involved in this. Don't fight. That's why he had to be in exile, because they were going to arrest him for telling the Russian people. By the way, the American socialist leader, Eugene Victor Debs, did exactly the same thing, and they put him in jail. Because he said to the American workers, you shouldn't be fighting in this. It's not a war about you. You should not be killing the workers of other countries. What the hell are you doing? You're doing the dirty work of the capitalists. They want a war, let them fight it. You shouldn't fight it.
Based Eugene Debs.
So Lenin was already strange, and now he's looking even stranger. But he pulled it off. He did it. He captured the state in a revolutionary way. And all of the people who had tried to do otherwise didn't. When the dust of World War I cleared, one socialist had captured state power. Nobody else had. And the one who had used violent revolution to do it. Amazing. And gave the Soviet Union an incredible position in the world of socialists. They're the ones who had done it. They're the ones who had done it. And immediately at the end of World War I, all socialists around the world split. They split on the following basic question. If the Russians did it, and they did it in that way, that's the way to go. And the other socialists said, are you crazy? That's peculiar. That's the special conditions of Russia. That was this and this. No. Don't draw that inference. They couldn't come to an agreement. So the people who thought that Russia showed the way withdrew from the socialist parties, withdrew from the socialist movement, and to underscore their view, they said, we're going to take a new name. We're going to call ourselves communists. That's where this comes from. That's where it begins. All communist parties start in 1921, 1920. They all begin in that split. The American Party, the Soviet Party, all of them. And it's a fight about what? How to make the transition from capitalism to socialism? No. How to capture the state. What should be your political path? Evolutionary with politics or revolutionary? That was the issue. Now fast forward. For 10, 15 years, 1917 to 1930, the Soviet Union, this new society, the only socialist society on the earth at that time, recovers from World War I, and to the surprise of everybody, starting with Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, and all the rest, to the surprise of all of them, they survived. Remember, they had lost World War I, then there was a revolution, then there was a foreign invasion. Again, I love to remind my American audiences. In 1918, 4 nations invaded the Soviet Union to destroy the new Soviet revolutionary government. Britain, France, Japan, and the United States. 10,000 American troops landed in Russia to overthrow their government.
True.
No Russian troops ever landed in the United States to overthrow anything. But Americans have been worried blue that it might happen and can't understand why the Russians could even imagine such a thing. History, unfortunately, doesn't work that way. So they were a destroyed society. They had a civil war on top of it. They came back quickly at enormous sacrifice to the Soviet working class to rebuild that society after World War I. And they had done it by the end of the 1920s at enormous sacrifice. But the problem was the government, and this is the most important thing that we'll have time for today, the government of the Soviet Union had replaced all the private industrial corporations. The private industrialists had mostly left Russia, became exiles, went to places like Paris, London, New York. or they became workers like everybody else. But they lost their position. The private corporate leaders, gone. The shareholders, gone. One of the first things the Russian Revolution did, close the stock market. There's no need for a stock market to buy and sell, because that stock certificate you have, tear it into strips and save on toilet tissue, because that's what it's worth. Gone. And the government came in and took over. The government appointed people to run the factories. In the aftermath of the revolution, the workers still went to work Monday to Friday. They did the same tasks they did before. But instead of doing it for a board of directors selected by the big shareholders, private capitalism, they did it for the government. What the government had done is seize the economy. But they hadn't transformed the economy, and they never did. Stalin declares in 1930-31, this is socialism. Lenin, dead by that time, would have, and probably did, turn over in his grave. No, he would have said, what we have, Lenin's phrase, is state capitalism. The state has become the capitalist. And that's important, and that's good that we did that. That's what the revolution accomplished.
Zoos. I mean, as Dr. Richard Wolff has helpfully clarified for us, I think Zeus was saying duly elected, but as Richard Wolff has helpfully clarified for us, communism and socialism really is roughly analogous to one another. They just differ on the ways of achieving power over the state. And in America, communism is such a filthy word that I think I don't believe we have any elected communists. However, I do believe that we have elected socialists. Bernie Sanders is definitely one of the most progressive politicians out there, and I would it frequently owns the label of being called a socialist. And I would wager that he is more in the camp of, the evolutionary path. He wants to obtain power by utilizing politics rather than a violent revolution to seize the state. So, yeah, that I would say Bernie Sanders solidly in that camp. I'm sure there are others on local or state levels who have been elected as well on a socialist platform. I would, however, say probably not very many, because of the amount of poison that has been put into our political discourse regarding socialism and communism. Boss, if you might have missed this part, but he talked about in 1918 the United States invaded Russia along with Great Britain and several other nations to help crush the fledgling USSR. True, we landed 10,000 troops there. That is a historical fact, by the way. We don't tend to talk about it in schools here because, the only wars that mattered of that period were World War I and World War II, right? You know? Yeah, 13 plus nations invaded. um, yeah, a lot of people went into Russia thinking it would be a very easy fight to overthrow the fledgling socialists, and they turned out to be wrong. In my country, we have a lot, both communist and socialist, in the Portuguese Parliament. Yeah, I mean, I think it's very different over in Europe. We don't have that sort of acceptance in the United States. There's a lot of indoctrination when it comes to capitalism, in the U.S. So I think we're just starting to get over that here. I think in the coming decades, we're going to see more and more socialists here as well. And probably most likely coming up in the Democratic Party. They might not even use the label socialist. In fact, I would advise anyone who's going into office right now to avoid using the socialist label, specifically because it will make it that much harder to find mainstream acceptance of different policies. But you know what? You can call yourself a progressive liberal in the Democratic Party and still pass policies that get us closer to socialism, and I think that that's what we should really be doing here. I advocate for that evolutionary style of socialism. I'm not if at all possible, I would love to avoid a bloodbath to bring in a newer and more equitable era of the United States.
And that was great. But now the task was to transform, and you, Stalin, you didn't transform, you just declared that, here we go now, when the state is in charge, we got socialism.
Yeah, and so this right here, what he's talking about, is one of the major ways that Stalin fucked up. And this is one of the major reasons that I'm not a tanky, and I don't advocate for tanky policies. Because tankies embrace Stalin and embrace what Stalin did. And I view that largely as a perversion of what socialism actually is, and a large reason why a lot of people in the United States today don't properly understand socialism as something that seeks to benefit them. Instead, they view it as something that is a symptom or a propaganda piece from like a despotic authoritarian, like Stalin. And that has led to all kinds of misunderstandings, and I think that overall, the declaration of Stalin that his party, his government taking over private industry was socialism, by means of well, the people support the government, and so if the government controls the private businesses, that means it's socialism. Well, that's not really what socialism is supposed to be about if socialism is about workers having control over their own workplaces, because you don't actually have control over your own workplace if the government is just the government that you abstractly voted for or supported is just installing people into your workplace and you're basically working the same as before. That's not socialism. It's Dr. Richard Wolff handily pointed out, it's not state socialism, it's state capitalism. Under Stalin became an authoritarian leader who centralized the economy and instituted a planned economy that still engaged in capitalism, just in a very different way from its surrounding neighbors. That's I don't think any socialists advocate for that. Celador, a tanky is someone who's like, yeah, China and Russia are super based leftist nations. Like they support like communism in name. Basically, I would describe a tanky as an authoritarian that uses the I think I got this definition from Vosh, which I encourage everyone to check out Vosh's channel. Much bigger than I am. Obviously, stick with me, help me grow, please, please, please. Basically, Vosh has described tankies as authoritarians with the aesthetic of communism or leftism, and I tend to agree with that. I don't think tankies are actual leftists. They're people who like jack off about thoughts of leading the violent revolution against the state and becoming like the new people in power. And I don't think that that's what our movement should be about. Our movement should be about tangibly improving the lives of people who live in our communities. And I don't think tankies are actually for that at all. Well, sorry, Pinko the Bear. I mean, I appreciate you. I appreciate the spirit of your revolution. I just wish that you would acknowledge that a lot of the people that you support, like Mao and Stalin and such, are not good. And weren't good even during their time, and that we can do what they did, but better and without killing lots of people. Um, who did you vote for? Oh, I voted for Joe Biden. We're riding with Biden, baby. Hey, it's Grady. Welcome back, Grady. Um, Socialists have 108 and communists 12, and all parliamentary is 230 deputy. So we actually have a lot of socialists. Well, that sounds pretty based, Zeus. Sounds pretty good. Um, yeah, but boss, the issue is that after World War I, when like Russia became socialist, became the USSR, countries in Europe fucking hated Russia because it was socialist, and that ran against their capitalist ideals. So yeah, they wanted to crush Russia and like make it into a you know subjugated state, but that didn't happen. Who do you think will win? Well, if we took a look at 538 prior to this, we'll take another look at it here. Um, Currently, Biden is projected with a 89% chance of winning the election, and Trump has an 11% chance. The only reason I'm not counting Trump out entirely is largely because he is in a position to institute a lot of disenfranchisement on his part. So we'll have to see when it comes down to the election. If I had to bet, if someone put a gun to my head and I had to put money on someone, I would put money on Biden. I would. But I also I encourage people not to get too comfortable, and if you're in a safe blue state, safe red state, vote for Biden, because we need as many people to vote for this motherfucker as possible so we can get him into office. Okay. Um, the implied probability on a Democrat bet is 66.6, so good choice. I thought the newest polls had Trump winning. Oh my dude, absolutely not. Um, this is an aggregate poll of like all of the polling that has been done, and then they take all of those polls and run it through simulations. Out of 40,000 times, 40,000 simulations, Trump won 11% of the time. Biden won 89% of the time. So, yeah, there's an extremely good chance that Biden wins in a landslide. There's actually a better chance of Biden winning over 400 electoral votes. I think there's like a two times better chance of Biden winning over 400 electoral votes than there is of Trump barely holding on to this election. So we'll see. But like even if you look down at like the smaller races, like the Senate, we have a 77% chance to flip the Senate. The House, 98% chance to hold on to power in the House. This is an overwhelmingly blue election, and I think it would be wise to bet on a Biden victory. Okay. Well, correction on your perception of we went over this earlier, but I'll go over it again to humor you. Okay. So here's the history of polling for both Trump and Biden. And you can see it kind of goes in Biden's favor, and then it goes back to level off. And then as we close in on the election here, the difference just slowly and steadily widens between the two of them. Now, if we look at 2016, which we can do relatively easily, here we go. 2016, 538. Here we go. We can actually look. So here is the polling as we go throughout 2016. It's much more inflammatory here. So, it starts off in favor of Clinton, gets real close after the conventions, then it spreads out again, and then it gets real close during the debates, and it spreads out again. And it's October 29th. So in 2016, we were right about here. So it was 81% chance in favor of Clinton, like about a 19% chance in favor of Trump. Um, and it was on a downward trend for Clinton and an upward trend for Trump. So then it closed in really close before splitting a little bit more at the end. Uh, Basically, in 2016, Trump had a 28.6% chance of winning, which doesn't, it's not a 0% chance. And, you know, like statistically, things happen like that, okay? Um, but the issue here is like Trump had over, you know, almost a three times was three times more likely to win the 2016 election looking at these numbers than he is currently projected in 2020. So I would just say, like, yeah, it's not impossible. Like a 10% chance to win is still a 10% chance to win. But I would say the odds are three times worse than they were in 2016. So we'll see how this goes, okay? But I wouldn't put money on Trump. I It's been so steady, unlike in 2016 where it was going up and down and up and down. Um, yeah, the voter suppression might make a difference, but well, no, like Liam one loop. You understand that just because someone isn't ahead in polling doesn't mean that they couldn't win, right? Like that's why if you look at the 2016 numbers, it says that the chance of Donald Trump winning is 28.6%. Like, you understand that that means there's a 28% chance of him winning, right? Like, polls don't predict the future. Polls just give you an idea of what to expect. Kind of like when the weatherman says there's like a 15% chance of rain today. Generally, you could probably make a plan outdoors, but 15% of the time, that plan is going to get rained on. Like, it's the same with politics, my dude. It's not an exact science, which is why they're giving you statistical probabilities and not telling you who's going to win. Well, if you get maths, then you understand why having someone ahead in the polls doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to win. Um, yeah, so it's pretty simple math. It's probabilities, and yeah, I'm telling you that while it's not impossible for Trump to win, he's doing three times worse than he was in 2016. So if I was a betting person, I wouldn't put money on him. Anyway, let's continue our socialist primer.
Wow. From being the means to the transition, seizing the state became the transition. From the means, it became the end. The end of the. We have socialism because the government has taken over. Even though the relationships between the government running the industry and the mass of people is not that different.
Okay, he does look like Bernie. He does kind of look like Bernie. But he is Dr. Richard Wolff, respected, well-known Harvard economist, and he talks a lot about socialism. And this is like a primer for socialism, so we're talking about it today.
From the relationship of the private individuals who used to occupy those positions in relationship to the mass of the working people. But for the next, what? For the next century, till here we are. We have a mass of people, most Americans, who think that socialism has something to do with the government being in charge. No, that's not the idea. The idea was to get the government because with that power, you could then make the transition. It wouldn't be the transition. It would be the step that would allow you to make the transition. And what would the transition be? Let's go back. To reorganize enterprises, factories, offices, stores, so that they would work in the interest of the whole community because the whole community would be making the decisions. not a small subset, the owners of the shares, the boards of directors, tiny minorities. No, 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 no. That's over. The question was, did the state transform the economy? And the answer is no, they didn't.
I mean, I have to just cut into chat here. Um, yeah, I mean, like he was within the realm of like probabilities here. So like even if we look at this, like here's the projected electoral votes, here's the projected popular vote. Like there is, you can see like significant variance. This is basically telling you we could be wrong by this much or this much, you know? And so like polling isn't the end all be all. Polling can be wrong, but or not wrong, but like that's why they tell you there's like a 5% margin of error. Like your candidate might have 5% less or 5% more. We don't know. You know? That's why there are margins of error.
Not because they're bad and not because they're stupid or nothing like that. This is the way the history worked out. It's an understandable thing. Poor Stalin. Well, he had to go to the Russian people who had sacrificed unspeakable in their lives. And what was he going to say to them? Thank you very much. You've sacrificed unbelievably now for the last 15 years. It's 1930, since the revolution. I'm glad to announce to you all what we have achieved is state capitalism. We got a whole nother sacrifice for God knows how many years to get to. They would have ridden him out of the town on a rail. He couldn't. So he did what politicians do. He substituted the wish for the reality. We've made it. We're here. Socialism is when the government does stuff. And it's more socialism the more stuff it does. And if it does a real lot of stuff, it's communism. Everything becomes how much to go. So the French think it's socialist if the government regulates a lot and owns a few things like, I don't know, Air France. Or the government makes Gitan cigarettes, which it does. But if the government takes over everything, that's not socialism, that's communism. The measure becomes how much the government does. This is a joke on Marx. Marx never wrote an article about the state. He wasn't interested in the state. He was interested in the transformation to a new system. And one final thing, that's all we have time for today, and we'll do some more in June. One more thing. Every economic system has had both private and state forms of that system. I'll give you an example. Enslaved societies, all through the history of the world, it wasn't always that only private individuals had slavery. Sometimes states owned slaves, though you'd have to speak of private slave economic system and state slavery. The Roman state owned slaves. Give you another example, feudalism. Many of the lords, say, of French feudalism were private individuals. But the French king, the state, also had serfs. So you had private feudalism and state feudalism. The reason we both call them feudalism is because they were the same system. It's just the difference between a private individual and a state official. Capitalism's like that too. You can either be a private capitalist, an individual who owns and operates a business as an individual with no relationship to the state, then you're a private capitalist. Or the government can do that. The government can hire workers, buy raw materials and tools and equipment, manufacture something and sell it in the market. You know, like, I don't know, Amtrak, TVA. 2,500 cities in the United States have a public power. I don't know if you're aware of that. 2,500 cities in the United States produce their own electricity as a public enterprise and sell it to their own people. Holyoke, Massachusetts, about 3 hours from here, is a perfect example. For the last century, they have an electric generating plant that produces electricity, which is then sold to the people of Holyoke. The profits from that are given by the Holyoke Electric Company to the city of Holyoke, which therefore taxes its citizens less, since they don't need to tax them as much, since they're getting the profit from producing electricity. That's state capital. The state is the capitalist. The state is the investor, the state is the employer, the state is the receiver of the profit, and the state is a determiner of what is done with the profit. The state is the capitalist. Does that mean we have socialism? Yes, if you are a senator from Alabama. And I don't mean to be critical of Alabama, but although I do enjoy that, I don't mean to be. The state is one thing. Socialism as something fundamentally different from capitalism is something else. Okay, we've run out of time. I promise you we will continue. Part of the major discussion on concepts of socialism are locked into this fetishization of the state, this focus on the state, which misunderstands the history, versus how many of the definitions of socialism really have to do with the transformation of an economic system, which is what Marx and his contribution was much more focused on. I think this is very important because my guess is that Bernie Sanders, as a socialist running for president, is the first of a much larger rediscovery by the United States of all of that taboo. You know, we can now talk about sexuality in a way that until recently was unthinkable in this culture. That suggests to me that something similar is possible and indeed, I think, coming in terms of these political and economic issues that we have to grow up as a nation to finally outdo the kind of childish fear and taboo that govern this. Personal illustration. As I have told many of you, I went to the best universities this country has. And I studied there and I went through their courses. And I majored in economics, history, stuff like that. Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, the only schools I ever went to, okay? I was never required to read Karl Marx on anything. That's childish. That's pee-pee on you. It's beneath any concept of reasonable, rational education. And this was at a time when more and more of the world was getting intrigued by Marxism. And as the world became more Marxist, Russia, China, Vietnam, Cuba, you name it, the blinders of American higher education became narrower and narrower, so that we now have a generation of people, most of whom, when they raise their hands when I give speeches and ask about socialism, what their questions amount to is not this or that detail. The basic question they ask me is, what is it? And at first, I was so distraught. My God, what is it? But then I realized they're asking me. And that's very good. Because I'd rather me answering that question than the kind of answer they would have gotten from virtually anybody else. So I stopped being upset, and I now understand I've got to do, people, and I'm not the only one, people like me are doing all over the United States, is reviving an awareness of something that shouldn't have been swept under the rug with taboo in the first place, but better late than never. Thank you all very much. I will see you in June.
Based Professor Wolff. I do have to say, guys, if you're interested in learning more or hearing more of this very, very intelligent man speak, he has a show on democracy at work, a very fine YouTube channel that I highly recommend. And he mans a show called Economic Update, where it's about a half hour long that premieres every so often. And I have found it immensely helpful in my understanding of economic issues in the world. very, very helpful. He's very intelligent. He has a very great way of being able to simplify complicated subjects down to digestible chunks. Um, and definitely go check him out if you have a chance. There's a lot of other stuff on democracy at work. And but by far, I think the best work that they do is supporting Dr. Richard Wolff and his talks. So check that stuff out.